In a world where status meant everything. A ranch foreman dared to say 5 words that broke every rule. "You're not my servant." But what begins as respect soon turns into something deeper and dangerous. Because loving someone from a different world always comes with a price. True love begins when we see someone for who they really are. This is a channel about Western cowboys, love stories, family, and the deep humanity that lives beyond status and hardship. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
I remember the day Molly Nash arrived like it was yesterday, even though the dust of all these years has settled since. I was shucking corn on the back porch, same as always, when the stagecoach rattled in. Out she stepped, holding a single beat-up bag like it was all she had in the world, looking like a lost calf. Mrs. Winters, our head housekeeper, took her in. But that woman's pity runs about as shallow as a creek in July. Right away, she had Molly on the hardest chores, the ones that break your back and your spirit. I saw it all from the corner of my eye, and a familiar bitter shame settled in my gut for just keeping my head down and my mouth shut. It was 1883, a hard year in a hard town, and survival meant staying quiet. 3 weeks she'd been with us, and I'd never heard a word of complaint out of her. Not when her hands were raw from the lye soap, not when her face was streaked with soot. There was a quiet strength in her, something from a different life where folks read books and played pianos, a life I couldn't imagine. I'd watch her sometimes, scrubbing away with a look so far off, and I'd feel a powerful ache in my chest. A guilt for every time I just walked past, for every time I saw Mrs. Winters lay a heavier burden on her shoulders, simply because she could. I knew it wasn't right, but fear's a powerful master, and I was its most loyal servant. That afternoon, the one that changed things, I was kneading dough in the kitchen. The air was thick with heat and the smell of yeast. Mrs. Winters sent Molly to clean the foreman's quarters, and I saw the mean little smile on her face. She knew Mr. Owens was particular and hoped Molly would earn a scolding. So when Molly came back through that kitchen door not an hour later, my heart near stopped. Her face was a storm of confusion, but something else, too. A light I hadn't seen before. I didn't see what happened in that cabin, but I sure saw the aftershock when it hit the main house. "He sent me back, madam," she said, her voice steady. "Said he'd clean his own floors." I stopped my kneading, my hands buried in the dough, and just listened. The air in that kitchen went tight as a fiddle string. I'd seen Mrs. Winters dress down grown men, but Molly just stood there holding her ground. I reckon if that had been me, I'd have been shaking in my boots, apologizing for something I didn't even do. But Molly wasn't me. And as I watched her, I felt a tiny seed of shame sprout into something that felt an awful lot like courage. The rest of the day, I couldn't take my eyes off her. When no one was looking, she'd pull out this book he'd given her, her fingers tracing the words like they were precious jewels. A bit of the worry had lifted from her shoulders, replaced by a quiet dignity. I kept picturing what must have happened, him telling her to get off her knees, treating her like a person. The thought was so foreign, it was like a fairy tale. Whenever I felt Mrs. Winters' cold stare land on me, I'd flinch and go back to my work, the old fear washing over me. But then I'd see Molly, and I'd feel that new feeling again, that little spark of defiance. "Get up, Sarah," Mrs. Winters' voice would snap, and I'd jump. But Mr. Owens, he was different. I'd see him talking to Molly near the stables sometimes, not like a foreman to the help, but like a man to a woman. He'd listen when she spoke, his head tilted just so. It made me see how twisted things were in that house, how we'd all just accepted that we were less than. He was showing her a different world and a part of me. The part that had been sleeping for years started to wonder what that world might feel like. My silence felt heavier each day. Mrs. Winters got meaner, her eyes following Molly everywhere, just waiting for her to slip. One evening she pounced, accusing Molly of shirking her mending to read that book. "Idle hands are the devil's workshop," she hissed, snatching the book from Molly's lap. "I'll be telling the master's wife you're lazying about." My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I knew Molly had finished every last stitch. The lie was so ugly, so sharp, and my silence was letting it do its work. I didn't know where the words came from. They just spilled out. "That ain't true, ma'am," I whispered, my voice trembling. Mrs. Winters spun around, her face a mask of pure shock. "I saw her," I said, a little louder this time. "She finished the whole basket before she even sat down." The world seemed to stop for a second. I saw the look on Molly's face, not pity, but surprise and a deep, honest-to-goodness gratitude. It was the first time I'd ever spoken out of turn, the first time I'd ever defended anyone. For a long moment, nobody moved. The weight of my small truth settled in the room, and Mrs. Winters, for the first time I could recall, was speechless. She shot me a look that could curdle milk, but she put the book down and stormed off without another word. Molly looked at me, a silent thank you passing between us that was louder than any shout. A terror, cold and sharp, washed over me, but right behind it came a wave of something warm. It felt like standing up straight after being bent over for years. That night I lay awake listening to the house settle. I was scared, no doubt about it, but seeing Molly across the room, sleeping with that book beside her, I felt a flicker of hope that I'd long forgotten. That Foreman, he'd shown her she had worth. And in my own small, fumbling way, I'd finally remembered that I did too. The guilt for all my years of silence was still there, a dull ache in my soul. But it wasn't alone anymore. It had hope for a neighbor now, and I had a feeling that tomorrow I might just be a little bit braver. I recollect that first day plain as yesterday. We boys came stomping into the dining hall ready to eat anything that didn't move, and there she was, Miss Nash, looking completely wrung out. Her dress was stuck to her with sweat, and her arms looked like they might fall off from the work. We were a loud bunch, always joking and carrying on, but she just moved between us with water pitchers, quiet as a ghost. Then Mr. Owens walked in, and you could have heard a pin drop. He had that way about him. All the men sat up a bit straighter. He took his place, and I started telling some fool story about a calf that ran me ragged, trying to get a laugh. But all I could think about was how she never got a moment's peace, and a bitter taste filled my mouth. As we ate our fill, I noticed Mr. Owens watching her. It wasn't that hungry way some men look, the kind that makes your skin crawl. It was different, more like he was standing guard, making sure none of us roughnecks gave her any trouble. After the meal, she was still at it, scrubbing pots while we were resting on the porch. By the time she finally shuffled off to her little room in the servants' quarters, the moon was high, and every soul on that ranch was worn to a frazzle. But she seemed to carry a deeper exhaustion. I'd lie in my bunk feeling a knot of guilt for just watching it happen, for saying nothing day after day, knowing it wasn't right. I was up before dawn heading for the kitchen when Mr. Owens himself appeared in the doorway, giving Miss Nash and Mrs. Winters a start. "Morning, ladies," he said, always polite. "Mrs. Winters, could I have a word with you?" The old housekeeper gave him a look, wiped her hands on her apron, and followed him out. I ought to have minded my own business, but I lingered, pretending to check my spurs. Their voices weren't loud, but they carried. "I want to make some changes to Miss Nash's duties," Mr. Owens said. "She's being overworked." Mrs. Winters bristled. "She's paid to work, Mr. Owens." "She's paid a pittance," he said back, his voice steady but hard as iron. "To be worked to death. Mr. Sullivan put me in charge while he's gone," he went on, "and that includes seeing to our people. If you disagree, you can send him a letter in Denver." There was a long, cold silence. Then Mrs. Winters asked, her voice tight, "What are you suggesting?" "Miss Nash gets 1 day of rest. Sundays are hers. Her pay goes up 50% starting today, and she eats her meals with the staff, not scraps after we're all done." I held my breath, listening. I'd never heard a foreman talk like that, standing up for one of the help. It was something fierce. He wasn't just making noise, he was making things right. "My instructions are to be followed," he finished. "Are we clear?" "Crystal clear, sir." Mrs. Winters came back in looking like she'd swallowed a wasp, but she kept her mouth shut. And just like that, things started getting better for Miss Nash. On Sundays, she'd walk to town or just sit and read one of the books that kept appearing near her room. We all figured it was Mr. Owens, though he never said a word about it. For the first time, you could see a little hope in her face, a glimpse of a future that wasn't just endless work. It made me feel good to see it, but also ashamed that it took him to do what we all should have seen needed doing. He stayed formal with her, just a respectful nod when their paths crossed, nothing more. I suppose he thought it was for the best. Then came the afternoon it all went to hell. Miss Nash was hanging laundry when shouting erupted from the barn. A bunch of us took off running, and I heard Mr. Owens yell, "Get back! Everyone get back!" I ran, and she ran too, her skirts whipping around her legs. She pushed through the crowd of us gathered by the corral, her eyes wide with fear. But I saw right away that she wasn't scared of the horse. She was scared for the man. In the middle of that corral was a black stallion, wild-eyed and kicking up a storm. Mr. Owens was trying to talk him down, but that horse was having none of it. "What happened?" Miss Nash whispered to me. "New horse," I said. "Came in this morning. They said he was broke, but they lied." The stallion charged, and Mr. Owens barely dove out of the way. It wheeled and came at him again. This time he wasn't quick enough. A hoof caught his shoulder and threw him to the dirt. Miss Nash screamed, a sound that ripped right through all the noise. In that second, I stopped being a watcher. A few of us boys went over that fence, hollering to draw the horse off, while two others dragged Mr. Owens out of the dust. We finally got the stallion penned, but my eyes were fixed on Mr. Owens. He was conscious, but the pain was written all over his face. "Get him inside," Mrs. Winters ordered, suddenly right there. "Someone fetch the doctor from town." We carried him to his room and laid him on his bed. Miss Nash was right there with us, shaking like a leaf as she watched him fight for breath. His shoulder was swelling fast, his shirt torn and already dark with blood. "I need to examine it," Mrs. Winters said. "Miss Nash, get hot water, clean cloths, and the medicine kit." She flew to do it, her fear plain to see. I just stood there, my hands feeling like useless stumps. The bruise was turning a sick shade of purple around a deep, ugly gash. Mr. Owens' face was pale, his jaw locked against the pain, but he was quiet. "This is going to hurt," Mrs. Winters warned, starting to clean the wound. He grabbed the bedpost, his knuckles turning white. We were all just standing there, crowding the doorway and watching. Then Miss Nash did something I'll never forget. She walked right up and took his free hand in hers. "Squeeze as hard as you need to," she said, her voice soft. His eyes met hers, and for just a second a look of gratitude replaced the pain. His fingers curled around hers, not to crush but to hold on. After Mrs. Winters bandaged him, I turned to the other hands. "All right, boys," I said quietly. "Let's give them some air." It was the first time I'd done more than just stand by. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Real lucky, Mr. Owens." But I heard Ethan grumble, "Doesn't feel that way," though his voice had a little bit of a grin in it. About an hour on, old Doc Harrison showed up, a stout fellow who'd been doctoring folks in Marysville for 20 years. He checked Ethan over good, pushing and prodding while Ethan just clenched his jaw. "No bones busted," the doc finally said. "But you got a nasty bruise, and that cut needs watching or it'll get mean. Gotta rest that shoulder for 2 weeks. No heavy work, no riding, and sure as heck no tangling with wild horses." 2 weeks? Ethan tried to sit and just about fell back with a pained sigh. "I can't be laid up for 2 weeks. There's a mountain of chores." "Well, you best have someone you trust to take the reins," Doc Harrison said, not giving an inch. "You push it, and you'll make it worse, and be down even longer. Y'all got someone who can help with the basics while you're laid up?" Every head in that room turned to Molly, standing right there by the bed. I saw her face turn red as a sunset. "Miss Nash has her own work to do," Mrs. Winters started in, but Ethan cut her clean off. "If Miss Nash is willing, I'd be grateful for her help, but only if she wants to. I ain't forcing nobody to play nurse." Molly, bless her heart, didn't even blink. "Of course I'll help. You've been nothing but decent to me. It's the very least I can do." And that settled it. For 2 weeks, Molly's main job was looking after Ethan. Mrs. Winters set another girl to Molly's chores, and Molly moved her little bit of nothing into the small room next to Ethan's. just in case he needed help in the night. Those first few days were a struggle. The man was in a world of hurt, even with the medicine Doc Harrison gave him, and sitting still was like poison to his soul. He was a man made for open sky and hard work, for fixing problems, not being one. Being stuck in that bed with one arm no good to him left him mad and fidgety. I watched Molly do all she could to ease his mind. She'd bring his meals, change his wrappings, and read to him when sleep wouldn't come. I saw her just sitting there listening while he let off steam. From my place in the hall, I'd hear bits and pieces about him growing up in Wyoming, the baby of 4 boys. His pa died when he was just 16, and he'd worked ranches all over, learning the cattle trade from scratch. Got to Utah 5 years back, I heard him tell her one afternoon. Mr. Sullivan gave me a job as a hand, but I made foreman in 2 years. He's a good man, square and decent, which is rarer than it ought to be. You've got a real knack for it, I heard Molly say, her voice soft. The men here look up to you. I see it when you're around. Respect's something you earn, he said back. I don't make my boys do what I won't. I treat 'em right, pay 'em fair, and I won't stand for meanness, not to man nor beast. I watched her set the soup bowl on his tray. Is that why you didn't want me scrubbing your floors? 'Cause you don't think anyone's beneath you? That's part of it. The other part is my mama worked herself to an early grave keeping our house together after my daddy passed. I saw her scrub till her hands were raw while my brothers wouldn't lift a finger calling it women's work. I promised myself if I ever had a say, I'd try to make things a little lighter for folks carrying a heavy load. The ache in his voice when he mentioned his mother was a familiar thing to me. It was a sorrow and a guilt he still carried, and my own heart hurt for him. I wished I could say something, but I just kept to the shadows. She'd be proud of you, Molly told him. You're a good man, Ethan Owens. I peeked around the doorframe and saw him look at her. Truly look at her. And it was like the whole room held its breath. Something heavy and unspoken filled the air between them. Then he looked down at his soup, and just like that, the spell was broken. As time wore on, they found a quiet rhythm. I'd see Molly up at sunrise with his breakfast, then helping him get washed and dressed. At first it seemed clumsy, but soon it was just what they did. She'd check his bandages, and I'd see her reading to him or mending clothes while he rested. Afternoons, she'd help him walk, keeping his muscles from getting stiff. He'd lean on her, his good arm around her shoulders. Even from afar, I could see the trust between them, the gentle strength she offered. They'd talk for hours. He'd tell her of his cowboy days, of stampedes and hard winters. And she'd tell him about her life in Salt Lake City, of music and picnics, and how fast it all disappeared when her father died. I was sweeping the porch one evening and saw them at the window, watching the sun bleed out over the mountains. You miss it? He asked her. The city life. I saw her think on it a moment. I miss my folks something fierce. I miss knowing I had a place to sleep and food to eat that no one could snatch away. But all the rest of it? The fancy visits and parties and all that talk? No, I don't miss that one bit. So what do you want? If you could have your druthers, what would you pick? It was such a plain question, but I saw it hit her hard. Nobody'd ever asked her what she wanted, like her dreams actually mattered. For so long, she'd just been trying to get by. A place of my own, she finally said. Just a little house with a garden for flowers and vegetables. I want to feel safe, to know I don't have to depend on someone else's kindness to survive. And I want my work to mean something. That ain't too much to ask for, Ethan said, his voice low. You deserve that, and then some. And you? Molly asked him right back. What is it you want? He was quiet for a long spell, just looking out at the purple shadows stretching across the land. I want to build something that'll last. Mr. Sullivan's mentioned selling me a piece of this ranch to start my own spread. I've been saving every cent, and in a few years I ought to have enough. But it's a lonesome business, running a ranch on your own. I always figured I'd have a partner, someone to share it all with. You talking about a wife? I reckon I am. He looked at her, then looked away quick. But finding a woman tough enough for this life, who ain't scared of the quiet and the long hours and the gamble of it all, that's the hard part. My own heart was thumping in my chest, just listening. I knew this was dangerous ground, with Mrs. Winters watching every move. I think you sell yourself short. Any woman would be lucky to have you. Would you? The question was so quiet I almost didn't catch it, but it hung there in the twilight. Molly's whole body went still. Would I what? Would you think yourself lucky to be with a man like me? I held my breath, waiting for her to laugh it off, to say something safe. But she didn't. Instead, she spoke the God's honest truth. Yes, I would. A silence followed that was louder than a gunshot. I saw his good hand reach out and touch her face, so gentle-like. And I saw her lean into it, her eyes closing. Molly, he said like a prayer. You need to know, I didn't ask you to do this to trap you. If you feel something for me, I need to know it's real, not 'cause you feel you owe me. She opened her eyes and looked right at him. And that's when I knew Mrs. Winters would bring hellfire down on her. The very next morning, that woman accused Molly of improper conduct, but something in me broke. I found Mr. Sullivan, and with my voice shaking, I told him, "Sir, that's a lie. Molly's been nothing but good." Straight. It all started the day I saw her on her knees, scrubbing my clean floors raw. A wisp of a thing, but with a spine of iron. I saw the look in our foreman Ethan's eyes when he first saw her, that flicker of something more than pity. For a time I held my tongue, a bitter judgment in my heart, worried he was a man taken advantage. He kept his distance, bless his heart, looking tortured by it. I watched him trying to do the right thing, his gaze following her when he thought no one was looking. But I was always looking. And the weight of my silence started to feel heavier than a sack of feed. It wasn't until he was laid up, helpless, that I saw the truth plain as day in the gentle way she cared for him and the way his eyes softened only for her. After that, something shifted between them. A new light took hold in Molly's eyes, and the burden on Ethan's shoulders seemed to lift clean off. I didn't see the moment it happened, but you couldn't miss the aftermath. It was in the air, thick as summer heat. He started coming to me, real formal, asking if he could take her for a walk on her afternoon off. He was intent on doing things proper, giving her the respect I now knew she deserved. I'd watched them from the porch, him talking and her listening, their hands never quite touching but wanting to. It was a slow dance, a careful building of trust, and every decent part of me hoped it would last. I started feeling a different kind of ache then. Not guilt, but a fierce need to protect what they were finding. He held true to his word, courting her right and proper. He'd come to the house, hat in hand, and ask me if he could take Miss Molly for a picnic down by the creek. I'd just nod, keeping my thoughts behind my teeth, though by then they were mostly prayers for their happiness. I saw him teaching her to ride that gentle old mare Buttercup, his hands steady on the rope, his voice low and calm. He'd bring her little bunches of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, not the fancy store-bought kind, but ones he'd picked himself. He knew that girl's heart. He was learning its every corner, and I saw her opening up like a morning glory in the sun, forgetting the hardships that brought her to our door. We all felt the chill when the gossip started drifting back from Marysville. Folks talking in church, whispers about the foreman and the help. It made my blood boil, but I just held my head high and told Molly to do the same. Happiness like theirs was rare, and I wouldn't let small minds tarnish it. Then the real storm blew in when Mr. Sullivan returned from Denver. He was a hard man to read, his eyes seeing everything. The day he called Ethan into his office, a cold dread settled over the whole house. I watched Molly trying to work, her hands trembling as she folded linens, her mind a million miles away. My own heart hammered against my ribs, fearing the worst for them both. What's the trouble? What did the boss have to say? I found her later, her face pale as a sheet. She told me what Ethan had relayed, How folks in town had written to Mr. Sullivan, tattling like school children about a foreman courting a serving girl. I felt that old guilt rise up, hot and sharp. My silence had let this fester. "He doesn't mislike you," she whispered, repeating Ethan's words. "He's worried about how it looks." I saw the choice lay in before them, cruel and unfair. Their love or her livelihood. "He ain't forbidden it," she said, a spark of hope in her voice. "He's given Ethan a choice. Either end it, or I stop working here." Her mind was already turning, I could see it, calculating the cost of love. If she left, she'd have nothing. A few dollars saved wouldn't last a month, I knew it, and the thought of her being cast out was more than I could bear. "I can't lose this job," she'd said to him, her voice barely a whisper. "I got nowhere to go." But Ethan, that good and steady man, he had a plan. He told her about the 200 acres he'd been saving to buy, enough for a small place of their own. It wouldn't be grand, but it would be theirs. And then I heard her telling me, her eyes swimming with tears, what he asked her next. "Ours," she'd repeated, her heart pounding fit to bust. "He asked me to marry him, Mrs. Winters. Said we'll build our future, and I'll never have to worry again. Said I'd be his partner." The tears that fell were pure joy. "Yes," she told him, 1,000 times yes." When she told me, I pulled her into my arms, holding her tight. And right then, I knew what I had to do. My small, courageous act wasn't standing beside her at the church, though I did that with more pride than I've ever felt. It was the letter I'd penned to Mr. Sullivan the week before he arrived. I told him plain about Molly's character, about the genuine love between her and Ethan, and about how this ranch was better for them both being on it. I stood for her not just in the church, but on paper, where it counted with a man like him. They married 3 weeks later, and I watched, my heart full, knowing I'd finally used my voice for something good. The sound of hammers rang across the north pasture the very next week. The other hands, good men all, gave up their Sundays to help Ethan raise the cabin walls. I'd watch Molly walking out to the site, carrying a basket of food, looking more like a queen than a former serving girl. She'd spread out a quilt, and they'd all sit in the shade, laughing and talking. It was a sight to behold. A home being built not just with wood and nails, but with friendship and hope. And as I stood on the porch of the main house, I felt a peace settle over me. Their little home was a testament, a new beginning that I, in my own quiet way, had helped protect. The world felt right again. It all comes back to me sometimes, clear as a bell, the first time I laid eyes on her. She wasn't watching a home get built. She was on her hands and knees scrubbing another man's floor. I was just a clerk back then, delivering papers to the big house. I saw a desperation in her that I'd never known. A while later, I saw her husband, Ethan, raising the walls of that little cabin, and the look on her face had changed entirely. It was a simple 2-room place with a loft, but to her, it was a kingdom. I filed the paperwork for their 200 acres from Mr. Sullivan myself. The terms were fair, more than fair, and for a moment I felt like I'd had a small part in something good. They moved in that autumn of 1883, and I'd ride past sometimes, just to see the lamplight in the window, a flicker of hope against the coming winter. I never heard the words they said, not really, but I saw them. I'd see Ethan come up behind her on that porch, his arms circling her waist as they watched the sun go down. I could only imagine the peace she must have felt. I reckon she was thinking about how much can change in a year, from being all alone and hungry to standing in a home of your own with a good man beside you and a future that wasn't a constant worry. I saw them together and knew he'd promised her she wouldn't ever be alone again. That first winter was a hard one, snow up to the windowsills. But from the road, all I ever saw was the warm glow from their fireplace. And I knew they were in there, facing it all together, building a life while I was just watching mine pass by. She had a knack for it, the ranching life. The town folk talked about how she took to the cattle gentle and smart. She wasn't just some rancher's wife. She was the heart of that operation. I'd see their little herd grow. And then I saw Ethan hire on a couple of young fellas to help out. That spring I saw her in town, a new light in her eyes mixed with a healthy dose of fear. It wasn't my place to know, but you could just tell she was expecting. I remember thinking about the papers I'd filed, the deed to their future. I hoped it was as solid as the love they were building on it. She looked like she'd make a fine mother, the kind of woman whose strength and patience would shape a child right. Their son would be lucky, I thought. When the baby came, Doc Harrison couldn't stop talking about it, a boy born right there in the cabin in December of 1884. Said it was a tough delivery, but Molly was tougher. They named him James. From then on, the years just seemed to pick up pace. I watched from a distance as that family and that ranch grew. Ethan was a natural father, always seemed to have a child in his arms when he came to town. The whole valley knew about the quality of their stock. Folks came from all over. Then came a girl, Sarah, in 1887, and another boy, Daniel, in 1890. I'd see them adding on to that little cabin, making more room for a life that just kept getting bigger and fuller. Life out here ain't ever a straight line, and they had their share of rough patches. Bad weather, sick cattle, money stretched thin as a whisper. I saw the worry on their faces, but I never once saw them turn on each other. Their bond was the one thing that never seemed to waver. I carried this knowledge like a stone in my gut, a secret I kept even from myself. They never forgot where they came from, and how a simple bit of decency from Ethan had changed everything. For their 10th anniversary, I heard they went back to the main ranch house for dinner. It ate at me knowing they were celebrating on ground I knew was less solid than they believed, all because of a detail buried in a file cabinet that I was too yellow-bellied to mention. I stood in the back of the little church in Marysville that night. Didn't want them to see me, just wanted to witness it. They renewed their vows, surrounded by their children and all the folks who'd seen their story play out. Old Man Sullivan was there, and he gave a toast that made my own throat feel tight, praising them for building something true. I heard folks whispering what Ethan had told her all those years ago. "You're not my servant." He'd seen right away she was meant for more than a life of scrubbing floors. And looking at her then, standing there so proud and loved, I knew he was right. She'd found everything a body could ever need, right there with him. My own silence felt like the heaviest sin. Their kids grew up good and strong. James was his father's son, through and through, born to work the land. Sarah had a gentle touch, a real gift with horses. And Daniel, he was the reader, always dreaming of a world beyond the valley. Then, in 1895, the world shifted. Mr. Sullivan passed on, a sudden heart attack. That's when the cold dread I'd been carrying turned to ice in my veins. His widow had no love for the ranch and put it all up for sale. In the office, I heard her talk. She had no intention of honoring her husband's handshake deals, and that included the generous terms he'd given the Owens family. I saw the paperwork she was drawing up, and I just stood there frozen. Ethan never changed. Even as their holdings grew after they and the other ranchers bought up the Sullivan place, he was still the same hard-working man. He was fair with his hands, treating them with a respect most cowboys never saw. He was a good man, a man who deserved an honest deal. I'd see him and Molly riding the property line together, him on his horse and her on that old mare Buttercup. They'd stop and look out over it all, everything they'd built with their own two hands from nothing but grit and love. In 1898, they threw a big wedding for James. The whole valley celebrated. And all I could think about was the lie their foundation was built on, a lie I was helping to keep. Sarah never did marry. She had a different fire in her, building a name for herself with her horses. Molly, bless her heart, backed her all the way. She knew what it meant for a woman to want her own purpose. In 1908, I saw them put Daniel on the train to Salt Lake City for university. They were so proud, but it hurt them to see him go. As Molly got into her 50s, I'd look at her and see the whole story. The frightened girl was gone, replaced by a woman made of pure Texas steel and heart. She had survived it all. It had been more than 20 years. My silence had festered into a sickness in my soul, and I knew I was running out of time to make it right. The truth is, I don't know what they talked about on their porch in the evenings. I wasn't there. I was in my lonely room, wrestling with a ghost. That night, after seeing them in town, so content, so unaware of the danger, something in me finally broke. I went back to the law office, letting myself in with my old key. My hand trembled as I pulled out the dusty file, the one the widow said was lost. There it was, Mr. Sullivan's original agreement, signed in his own hand. Before the sun came up, I rode out to their ranch. I left the file on their porch, tucked where the wind wouldn't take it. I didn't knock. I just rode away, the weight of 2 decades finally lifting, leaving behind nothing but the truth and a prayer that it would be enough. I reckon I would have been a lonely man, Ethan told me once years later as we watched their children play. I'd have had the ranch, maybe, but my heart would have been empty. I wouldn't have known what I was missing, but the missing would have been there all the same. I just nodded. The good Lord brought you two together right when you both needed saving, I said. She saved me just as much, he said, and I knew it was the gospel truth. I watched their grandchildren come along in the early 1900s, filling that ranch with more life than I thought possible. Strength, kindness, a will to work. It was all there in those little ones. I saw Molly teaching the girls to sew and the boys to care for the animals, her spirit woven into the fabric of the family. I saw Ethan build a playground for them, his hands, once calloused from ranch work, now carefully carving little wooden horses. As the years wore on me and I started to slow, my own steps getting shorter, my love for them only grew. They had weathered every storm that life threw at them, and their bond was stronger than the oldest oak on the property. Then in 1910, their boy Daniel came back from university with a teaching job and a bright young wife. He was a scholar, his path different from the rest. Seeing him bring his love home to the house built on love felt like the circle was complete. My silence had almost cost them everything, but in the end, a few honest words on a piece of paper had been enough to help build a kingdom. From cattle work, he always made time for family, visiting them and bringing his own kids to see the land where he came from. Sarah eventually married in 1912, finding a quiet veterinarian who loved horses as much as she did. Their wedding was a small affair, just how she wanted, and I saw Molly cry happy tears as her girl pledged her life to a good man who truly cherished her. By 1915, the Owens Ranch was a landmark in central Utah. It gave work to dozens of folks and shipped cattle all over the West. That first little cabin they built, now used for storage, was a reminder of how far they'd come. But for all their success, Ethan and Molly never forgot where they started. They gave to local charities, helped families who were struggling, and always stood up for the fair treatment of working people model. I reckon I was just a boy when Molly Owens first seemed like an angel to my mama. She gave us a place when we had nothing, a chance to breathe. And for a while I thought we'd found heaven on that ranch. But the man Mama married, the one Molly thought was our salvation, he had a shadow that only came out when the Owens weren't looking. I saw other women she helped, saw them build new lives, and I'd pray their stories were simpler than ours. From our little piece of land, I'd watch the Owens place, so close but a world away, and wonder if Mrs. Molly ever knew how heavy her kindness could feel. As she and Mr. Ethan got on in their years, they trusted others with the ranch, never knowing the full story of the folks right next door. I remember their 40th anniversary back in 1923. We were invited, and the whole valley showed up. The party was a big to-do, music and laughing that rolled across the fields for 2 whole days. But I sat there, a knot in my stomach, listening to folks talk about 4 decades of a good marriage. When Mr. Ethan was asked his secret, he took a long pause. "Respect," he said. Real quiet-like. I respected Molly as my equal from the jump. That word, respect, it burned a hole right through me. I looked at my mama, holding a smile so tight it hurt to see. Molly spoke of love as a daily choice, and I knew Mama was making a choice every day too, the choice to survive. We all just kept on, working toward goals that weren't really common. That kind of fear is built through 1,000 little silences over the years. I suppose their wisdom struck a chord with the other young couples there. hoping for what the Owens had. They were a living testament to a real partnership, a bright light that made the shadows in our own house seem that much darker. Through the late 20s, as their ranch just kept on growing, ours felt smaller and smaller. They had newfangled machines, but we were stuck. I'd see Mrs. Molly on her porch at sunrise looking so peaceful. Her body might have been slowing, but her spirit was a fire I was too scared to get close to. She took such pride in her family, in the land she and Mr. Ethan had tamed, and the community that held them up so high. Mr. Ethan, even with his silver hair, was still a presence. He'd ride out, his eyes still sharp, especially when they landed on his wife. I saw the way he looked at her, and it was a language I'd never heard spoken in my own home. For their 50th anniversary in 1933, the Depression had a chokehold on the country. The Owens weathered it, a testament to their smarts. Our celebration was just surviving another day. Their party was quieter, but the love was just as loud, and for me, just as painful to witness. Their kids, all grown with their own families, came to praise the folks who gave them such a fine start. I stood at the edge of the crowd when James, who was running the ranch by then, talked about his daddy. He said success was about the lives you touch and the legacy you leave. He said his folks taught him to treat people with dignity, that it was good business. He talked about loyalty, and I thought of my mama's loyalty, born of fear. Sarah spoke about her mother's fire, how Molly taught her a woman's worth wasn't tied to a husband. My mother taught me that being a wife meant becoming invisible. And Daniel, the book-smart one, talked about how his parents fed his curiosity, even when it led him far from the ranch they loved. As I watched Molly listen, tears of joy making tracks on her face, I felt like the worst kind of liar. I was part of her happy picture, the boy from the family she'd saved. She was looking back on a blessed life, thinking of that scared girl she used to be. She couldn't have imagined the scared boy standing right there, holding a truth that would have broke her heart, all because a good man had seen her worth, and a bad one had hidden my mama's. That night, I knew there was no peace for folks like us. "Thank you," I heard Mr. Ethan whisper to her once. I wasn't meant to hear it, but I did. He thanked her for saying yes, for building a life, for their kids, for her love. Every word was a testament to a world I couldn't touch. "Thank you for seeing me as more than a servant," she'd answered him. "Thank you for respecting me." They held each other, knowing they'd face whatever came next together. For us, the years passed one by one, quiet and heavy. The ranch kept on. The Owens legacy was secure. New babies were born into that big, warm light. Generations would come and go. When Mr. Ethan passed in his sleep in the winter of 1938, the whole valley mourned. Mrs. Molly found him gone, his face at peace. She held his cold hand, grieving but grateful for 55 years with a good man. The funeral was something else. Hundreds of folks came. Ranch hands, businessmen, all talking about his fairness and his integrity. But it was James's words that finally broke something loose in me. "He was a man who believed in dignity," he said, his voice cracking. "He treated the newest ranch hand with the same respect he showed a governor." "He taught us that character," James said, "is about how you treat people when you have power over them." I stayed 3 more years in silence, watching Molly grieve, watching her stay in that house full of memories. She was surrounded by family, but missing her other half. Then one afternoon I walked over there. She was on the porch, just like always. My hands were shaking, my secret 30 years heavy. I sat down and I told her. I told her about the man she thought was a savior, and the life my mother had really been living. I told her for my mama, for Mr. Ethan's memory, and for the scared boy who'd finally found the courage to speak. I stood near the back of that same church where she'd married Ethan 58 years before. It was filled to the rafters, just like it was for him. All the women she'd helped find their footing over the years were there to say goodbye. I heard folks speak of her charity and good heart, but it was her own family who really got to the heart of her. Sarah spoke about her mother's grit, said she'd weathered storms that would have leveled most people. She'd known hard times, loneliness, and fear, but it never made her bitter. Instead, it gave her a heart for others in the same boat. "The strongest woman I ever knew," she said. and I knew she was right. They buried Molly and Ethan together on that hill looking over the ranch, right under two cottonwoods they'd put in the ground themselves. Their headstone was plain, just their names, the years, and a line their kids chose. Partners in love and life, together forever. That ranch they poured their souls into is still going strong, run by their own blood for generations. The first cabin's still standing, looked after real careful, a little family museum full of memories from the early days. Grandkids visit to remember where the Owens story really started, in a plain two-room house built on sweat and devotion. The values Molly and Ethan lived by, respect, honesty, hard work, and kindness to all folks, no matter their station, became the family creed passed down the line. Their kin carried those lessons into all sorts of work, never forgetting the man and woman who started with nothing but each other and built a life that would last. The story of their meeting turned into family lore, told to every new child. The tale of the ranch boss who stopped a frightened young woman from scrubbing his floors, who saw her worth when the world told him she was just help, echoed down through time. It taught every new Owens that the way you treat people with less power is what truly shows your character. Now, in the 21st century, when the family gathers at the ranch that grew so big from such a small start, they always walk up that hill where Molly and Ethan rest, standing under those big old cottonwoods, gazing out at the land that has fed their family for so long. They think on the incredible love that made everything possible. Two souls from different worlds, thrown together by fate but bound by choice, who built more than a ranch. They built a legacy of love and dignity for generations to come. The foreman who saw past what society expected and recognized the value in a person, and the serving girl who proved a person's beginning doesn't define their soul. Their love story, which started with a simple kindness one afternoon in 1883, grew into something powerful over 55 years of choosing each other day in and day out. It was proof of what can grow when you see and value another soul for exactly who they are. And so, their legacy lived on, not just in the ranch, but in the family's heart. But I've always carried the fear that the sharp edges of the story might get worn smooth over time. So yesterday, I finally did something. I sat down and wrote a letter, telling it just how I saw it that first day, and put it in the old family Bible. I wrote about the foreman who saw a woman scrubbing his floors and spoke 5 words that changed their world forever. "Stop! You're not my servant."